Most Christian believers have a before and after story. Time divides itself for us. There was a time before we believed, and there is who we are now. With the passage of even more time, we look back and recoil at some of the stories from our time before. We don't want to ever be that person again. Nevertheless, every such story is a pearl of great price and a testimony to what God has done. A long time ago, there used to be lay witness missions, which amounted to special worship gatherings in which lay people traveled about and told their own before and after story. These were often very emotional and powerful testimonies to the grace of God. They lacked the polish of a Billy Graham crusade, but they connected with people on a grassroots level and led many to their own before and after experience. The Apostle Paul's before and after moment came as he neared Damascus. He was struck by a bright light and knocked to the ground. And in that moment, he heard a voice say to him, "It is hard, is it not, to prick against the goad?" That hints strongly at the fact that Paul was already troubled by his way of life. His conscience was wounded, and God was already guiding him toward that moment in time when the course of his life would be forever changed. Looking back later, Paul would write, "For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." His story, like that of many others, seems almost unbelievable. He went from holding the cloaks while others stoned Christian believers to death to becoming a believer himself, and the means by which the gospel spread throughout an empire. God, on the other hand, had it all planned. The apostle of grace needed to be someone who was truly indebted to God for his grace and mercy. In the second chapter of the book of Ephesians, the before and after divide is more fully delineated, although it can be hard for us to understand it quite like they did. "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins," we read, "in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath." The kingdom of the air was for them a place of demons who inhabit that space between earth below and heaven above, corrupting the world and seeking to keep God out. We needn't be quite so literal to understand that it is most often our desires and thoughts which determine our actions in this world. Literally, the words used here refer to flesh and mind. In other words, the id and the superego of classical psychology. Our basic urges and needs and desires direct our life choices toward their own goals. We are hungry, and so we fix dinner and eat. Sometimes we are actually barely conscious of the process. What psychologists called the ego is mostly where we live and have our being. We live somewhere in between those desires and the thoughts of our minds, making whatever realistic choices we can make to try and satisfy the demands of both. The superego, however, is the place of principles and conscience. Here we are more idealistic in our concept of who we are, or at least who we want to be. Here, principles matter and can override all of our other choices. It's not hard to imagine that on the way to Damascus, Paul's conscience was working overtime. Nevertheless, that is not enough to explain the change that took place in him. For Paul, it was like the difference between life and death. Because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions, so we read in the book of Ephesians. Moreover, to him, it was the hand of God, a force outside of himself, which acted to bring him to life. "For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith," he wrote, "and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. The common phrase we like to use nowadays is, Jesus came into my life. Paul would understand that quite literally, of course. A psychologist might term it as allowing our superego to gain more influence over our lives. Honestly, however, I tend to go with Paul. Nothing else so fully explains that moment when everything changes so completely and you actually feel the presence of God. Life, the universe, and everything begins to make sense after that. God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus, we read, in order that in coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus. So, if earth is the place we live, and heaven is far above us, and in between there lies a realm of demons, either within or without, intent on keeping us from knowing and experiencing the presence of God, then only God can cross that divide, to find us and lift us up. So goes his thinking. We can think of it as God's presence now, lifting us up to higher ground. One person described it this way: Christian life is examined in terms of a before and after contrast resulting from divine intervention. The enactment of divine love and grace has radically altered everything about who we are and whose we are, about how we live, why we live, and even where we live. That goes along with what we read in Ephesians as well. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. The universe has a design plan. History is the means by which God is still creating. To God, every detail matters, and we are part of the plan of God in this time and place, just like Paul was part of God's plan in that long ago time and place. Who we are, how we live, and what we do with our life matters to God far more than we can ever imagine. One of the stunning things for me in the wake of the Capitol riot was to hear someone who had been there coming to grips with how so much of what she believed might not have been true. I like being angry, she said. If it isn't true, then I can't be angry. Paul, too, liked being angry. He vented that anger upon the Christian community, believing them to be evil. He enjoyed the feeling of doing that, and he thought that he was doing what was right. That is part of our base code. Anger can possess us. Aggression can become the way we respond to everything in life. But it doesn't have to be. The id does not have to control us. Later on, Paul would also write these words: love is patient, love is kind. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. It is God's desire that we live our lives on higher ground in such a way as to make this world a better place. God has invested heavily in this project and in you. After all, God gave his only son to help you find a better way to live. In considering the before and after of our Christian lives, I like the words of Psalm 107. Some were sick through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities endured affliction. They loathed any kind of food, and they drew near to the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. and deliver them from destruction. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind, and let them offer thanksgiving sacrifices and tell of his deeds with songs of joy. Seek the Lord now while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Invite him into your life, and let this be the moment now when before and after begins for you by the grace of God. Be safe, and God bless you.